Ballad of Never After, Chapter 9. Evangeline fought to open her eyes, but her lids were impossibly heavy. She wasn't sure if she was awake or asleep. She thought Jack's had been there before it all went black, but the arms that held her now were scorching hot, or maybe she was the one burning up. She could hear a conversation, but it was barely there. Mostly low words and growls of two arguing voices with few scattered words. She, venom, human, risk, want, die, no. Her captor tightened his grip, pressing her against the chest clad in leather that smelled of metal and smoke. Definitely not Jack's. Evangeline felt a sudden rush of alarm. Let go, she managed. Relax, said a voice she didn't recognize. I'm not going to hurt you. No. She tried to claw at her kidnapper, but she couldn't move her fingers. Her body was swelling. She was made of useless limbs and broken eyelids. Her skin was dry in blood, and her thoughts were turning gray. But there was one thought brighter and more frightening than all the others. If she was injured, then so was Apollo. He was bleeding somewhere else, probably outside in the dark garden. Apollo, she finally managed. Prince Apollo needs help. Her captor tensed. Then she heard another voice so quiet she knew it was in her head. I'm sorry, little fox. Apollo isn't who you need to worry about. He's... Evangeline started to lose consciousness once more because she caught the rest of Jack's thoughts. Although she knew what he was going to say, Prince Apollo was the reason for her injuries. Seconds passed as if they were hours. Evangeline could not stay awake for long, but when she did, the pain extended every moment in a century, a lifetime of hurt in exchange for one moment of consciousness. She was just aware enough to feel cool arms cradling her now. Jack's arms. Everything was fuzzy and distant, but she knew somehow that these arms held her closer than the hot arms ever had. And yet, Evangeline found herself drifting away from the arms and into a dream that felt like the pages of a story yellowed with age, the ballad of the archer and the fox. Evangeline had always loved this story, though, as she returned to it now, it was tainted with a sadness she could not recall feeling before. The tale began the same as it always did, with the most gifted archer in the magnificent north. He was young and handsome, and admired, and he'd been hired to hunt a fox. It was the craftiest fox he'd ever met, and he hunted for weeks. The fox would catch him sleeping. It bit his ears and chewed his shoes. It made his life misery, but the archer never managed to capture it. The only joy the archer had while hunting the fox was the days he saw the girl. He didn't know her name at first. She was just a pretty peasant who lived in the forest, but he found himself wanting to chase after her instead of the fox. She talked to him in riddles, and when he got them right, she'd bring him little treats. He slowed his hunt for the fox, wanting a reason to stay in the forest with this peasant girl. She was clever and sweet, and she made him laugh. But the peasant girl had a secret. She could change into a fox, the very fox he was hired to hunt. After learning this, the archer believed those who had hired him had made a mistake. He returned the coins he'd been given and told them the fox was really a girl. But his employers already knew this, and they were not happy that he refused to hunt her, so they put a curse on him, one that compelled him to hunt the girl that he now loved. Evangeline's heart began to race at this part. Whenever her mother had told her this tale, she always forgot what she was saying right before she finished the story. And now, Evangeline was starting to reach the end. She could feel the archer's confidence mingling with his fear as he sat in the forest outside his beloved's cottage. The archer had always been so very sure of himself and what he could do. He'd never been given a task that he could not complete. There was no beast he could not track, no target he could not hit. He could shoot an apple from the hand of a friend and 1,000 paces away, while it was being tossed in the air. He was a legend. He was the archer, and he would have sacrificed it all to save her. Yet, even as he thought the words, the archer looked down to see he was already notching an arrow, getting ready to shoot the girl he loved as soon as she stepped out of the cottage. The archer threw down the bow and cracked the arrow on his knee, wishing it was as easy to break the spiteful curse. He'd been told it would only lift when he killed the girl. The one way to save her would be to stay away. But he couldn't believe they were never meant to be. There had to be it. The dream dissolved, like raindrops washing away peddler's chalk on a sidewalk. Evangeline fought to hold on to it. She wanted to know how it ended, but the harder she tried to remain in the dream, the more it began to fade, until she couldn't remember what she'd been dreaming at all. Everything hurt when she awoke. She was no longer being held by hard arms or cold arms or any arms at all. She was on her back, every inch of her burning, aching despite the softness of the bed she'd been placed in. Her eyes fluttered open, slowly adjusting to the light. There were just enough for Evangeline to see a set of heavy cage-like iron bars crisscrossing above her. She jolted upright. Her wounded shoulder screamed in pain, and she fell gracelessly back on the mattress. "Welcome back, Princess." The voice was velvet smooth, and it did not take long for Evangeline to identify the source. Chaos, the vampire lord of spies and assassins, leaned casually against one dark bedpost with the ease of a being that had nothing to fear. Evangeline tried to muster a bit of bravado, but she felt instantly immobilized. She now knew why there were cage-like bars over her bed. She was in Chaos' underground castle. Evangeline had only visited once before, but she vividly remembered all the human-sized cages hanging amid the old-world elegance of the halls. She shuddered to think why she might be here. Frantically, she sifted back through her memories. The last several hours were blurry until she reached the moment right before she passed out. She'd been inside Wolf Hall, bleeding everywhere, and Jax had said her name. Evangeline, not Little Fox. Then he said he was sorry. Was this why? Because he'd given her over to Chaos? "Am I a prisoner?" she asked. "You can leave any time," Chaos said. "But I doubt you'll get far on that injured leg." He nodded toward her wounded thigh. The vampire's face was impossible to read due to the cursed bronze helm he wore. It wrapped around his forehead and jaw, covering his mouth, so that he could not bite her. Yet she still felt far from safe in this castle. Evangeline gritted her teeth and looked about the room for an escape. It was around the size of her suite at Wolf Hall, with a fireplace full of candles, dark velvet lounges for sitting, and a dresser for clothes and jewels. It also had a great rounded door, but it was on the opposite end, a distance that seemed insurmountable with her wounded leg. But she could not stay in this bed. She needed to get out of here. She needed to figure out why Apollo had attacked her. She didn't believe that Apollo had wanted to hurt her. That was clear to her now. He looked pained, anguished. He told her to run. He tried to save her before he tried to kill her. She needed to figure out why. Evangeline started to push down her sheets, but stopped as she realized that her clothing had been removed. She was practically naked. Instinctively, she clutched the sheets tighter. She didn't even want to contemplate who had undressed her. She wore nothing save for a short, thin silk slip and the cloth bandages that wrapped around her wounded shoulder and thigh. She couldn't get out of bed like this. Chaos might not be able to bite her, but if they were in his lair, then other vampires could, and they probably would. Walking around in a scrap of silk felt like an open invitation. "If I really can leave, then I'd like some clothes and shoes," she said. Chaos laughed softly, the sound deceptively young. He appeared just a few years older than she was, but Jax had once told her that Chaos was as old as the North. "I may have exaggerated when I said you could leave at any time." The rounded door opened with a ground that betrayed its age. Then sadly, Jax stepped inside. Their eyes collided across the room, his gaze slowly lowered to the sheets that she held over her barely there slip. And then, before she even had time to blush, he looked away. Evangeline felt a strange stab of disappointment as Jax went back to tossing the shimmering black apple that he held in his hand. The cloak he'd been wearing earlier was gone. She remembered that he carried her, but there was no blood on his soft gray doublet. "Have you told her the good news?" he asked cheerfully. "Not yet," Chaos replied. Evangeline divided the look between them, confused. Did not begin to describe how she felt. Jax loathed the vampires. Or at least that's what she thought. The last time she'd been here with him, he seemed to hate every moment. Now Jax appeared completely at ease, and the comfortable way that he and Chaos spoke made it seem as if they were almost friends. "What's going on?" Evangeline asked. But even as she asked it, the pieces fell into place. Jax had told her that if she didn't agree to open the arch within a day, she would really hate him. This must have been why Jax was working with Chaos. Evangeline flashed back to her conversation with Luce, how she revealed that Chaos was the one who helped him steal the throne. It was bizarre to imagine that Jax would be involved with this ruse as well. but after letting loose was the air, Evangeline's first thought had been that she needed to wake up Apollo more than ever. Perhaps if she had more time, she would have turned to Jax. It still seemed extreme, but Jax was willing to go to impossible lengths to get what he wanted. She looks confused, Chaos said. Jax stopped tossing his apple and turned to Evangeline. Your husband almost killed you. Because of him, you have a ruined shoulder and deeply wounded leg. Left to human methods, it will take your shoulder weeks to heal. Your leg will take longer and will probably never be the same. There's also the risk of death from infection, but Chaos has kindly offered to help the healing process along. A female vampire with dark hair and red lips entered the chamber and approached the bed where Evangeline lay. No, she clutched her sheets tighter, understanding dawning as the female bared her fangs. There were two types of vampire bites, one that allowed vampires to merely feed, and ones that infected their prey with vampire venom. Vampire venom had tremendous healing properties, but it also had the potential to change the infected person into a vampire. Being bitten didn't mean a person would have to change. Any human infected with venom had to drink human blood by dawn to transform into a vampire. But Evangeline had seen what vampire venom did to humans, how it turned them desperate enough to break cages and locks just for one bite. Evangeline had no desire to be a vampire now, but what if that changed when she was infected? We should get started, Chaos said. This won't be easy, but we have shackles to restrain you. He motioned toward a wall. In between a pair of velvet drapes, Evangeline saw two sets of chains with manacles. Or, if you prefer, we could put you in a cage. No, Evangeline vehemently shook her head. I don't want to do this at all. Let me heal on my own. She looked pleadingly at Jax. He bit down carelessly on his apple and turned to Chaos. I think you should use the cage. As soon as Jax said the word, Chaos reached for a lever and bottled in the wall. Bars instantly crashed down around her bed, trapping her inside. No! It all happened so fast. Evangeline didn't even know she screamed until she heard her voice echo through the room. She tried to grip the steel, but that was a mistake. Chaos grabbed her wrist through the bars. I'm doing you a favor. Holding her tight, he offered her arm to the female vampire. Evangeline struggled and cried out again. Teeth flashed, and then she felt them sink painfully into her wrist. Chapter 10. The Ballad of Never After. Everything burned from one sharp moment. Evangeline fell back against the bed. Then, the pain dissolved, not just from the bite, but from her wounds, which healed almost instantly. She blinked, and it was as if a veil had been lifted from her eyes. When she first woken up, the room had been dim, a swoot of smoke and shadows. But now it sparkled with glitter like candlelight. It was the prettiest shimmer she'd ever seen. Everything in the room seemed to glow. The gilded portrait frames, the polished legs of the table, even the awful manacles on the wall. Then there was a bed, which felt even more luxurious. Her pillows, the mattress, the sheets wrapped around her body were so much softer than before. They were silken white, and Evangeline swore she could smell the color, crisp and clean and bright, like sunshine streaming through an open window after a mist of rain. Crunch! Jax took a bite of his apple, drawing her attention to the foot of the bed, where he stood, looking like external heartbreak. His fair skin faintly glowed, his eyes shone like stolen stars. His hair was spun gold, and the cruel planes of his face filled her with a longing so deep it felt like an ache. She wondered if Jax always looked like this, and her human eyes weren't capable of taking him in, or if he somehow dampened his appearance. But now that she had the venom surging through her, she could see what he really was, despite any of his efforts to try to hide it. Just one look set her blood on fire, and she liked the way it burned. She tried to take a deep breath, but when she inhaled, all she could smell was the dark sweetness of him, and she wondered how he'd taste. Would he be cool on her tongue? Would brushing her lips over his neck stop her blood from burning and her heart from racing? Jax took another bite of his apple. Her incisors immediately lengthened. She pushed her tongue against them, trying to shove the sharp points back in and stop the sudden throb on her mouth. She really didn't want to bite him. His blood was human enough, and if she bit Jax, she would change. But just thinking the words bite and Jax sent a shudder through her that wasn't entirely unpleasant. Careful, Jax drawled. You're not looking at me as if you hate me right now. I do, she said, but I came out all wrong, hoarse and breathless and hungry. Her fangs sank into her lips, hard enough to draw blood. Jack's eyes lashed onto the drop. Something unreadable flashed across his perfect face, and then his voice was in her head. Do not forget what happens if tonight goes badly. You do not want to become one of them. Jack's thoughts were full of disdain. He might have been friends with Chaos, but it seemed the Prince of Hearts still didn't like vampires. He dropped his black apple on the floor and stalked towards the rounded door. Don't leave, Evangeline growled, the words coming out before she could stop them. She knew it was better if he went. Without blood, she couldn't turn into a vampire, but she couldn't believe that he was simply walking out the door. When he'd been infected with vampire venom, she'd stayed an entire night with him to make sure he didn't bite a human and change. But tonight, he'd only spared her a few moments. She gripped the bars of her cage tight enough to dent them. Then, horrified, she pulled away. She hadn't even realized that she moved. Even now that she released the cage, her hands were clenched into white-knuckled fists, as if her body still wanted to break free. In a flash, Cass was right in front of her, leaning against the bars with that her hands still wanted to grab. For vampires, control requires time, Chaos said. Part of the way we move so fast is because our physical forms are guided by instincts that humans do not have. Like Jax, the vampire appeared more dangerously immortal. She hadn't noticed his clothes before, but now she saw that, for once, Chaos wasn't dressed like a soldier. He wore tailored black pants, a fine black shirt, and his cursed bronze helm, which had been detailed carvings that then she hadn't noticed. The spikes that jutted out over his cheekbones were covered in tiny thorns that they pointed toward his hypnotic eyes. She usually tried to avoid his eyes. Vampires took direct eye contact as an invitation to bite, or a means to control. But right now, Evangeline didn't even have control of herself. It was just as Cal said, and he thought she had turned into movement. She thought about his eyes, and suddenly their gazes locked. But her Chaos eyes were not the same eyes she remembered. She would have sworn they were emerald green, but now they were pure shadow. They were dark and endless and devouring. This didn't feel like looking into a pair of immortal eyes. It felt like locking eyes with death itself. Chaos is a murderer, Lala had once said, and Evangeline now saw it in his gaze. His helm might prevent him from biting, but it did not prevent him from killing. Evangeline tried to back away and instantly felt her spine slam against the other end of the cage. Chaos laughed, low and silkier than she remembered. You're not in danger from me, Princess. In fact, I'm here to make sure nothing happens to you tonight. She caught a whiff of apples then, sweet and briskly cool. It was a fruit Jax had dropped onto the floor. He left the room, but just the thought of him brought a new exquisite ache to her mouth, a burn that she knew in her soul only one thing could stop. You're growling, Chaos warned. Evangeline wrapped her hands around the bars of her cage, the ones right in front of Chaos. Again, she didn't even remember moving across the bed, but this time she didn't let go of the bars. Pressing her hands against the metal, feeling it dent under her strength, helped take her mind off the throbbing in her mouth and the pain in her gums as her fangs lengthened again. Careful there, Chaos' hands clamped down on Evangeline's. He might have broken her fingers with his powerful grip, if not for the venom surging through her. But that didn't mean his hold didn't hurt. Let me go, she yanked against him, fighting to pull free until her breathing turned back. Meanwhile, Chaos wasn't even winded. If anything, his shadow gaze was ablaze with something like excitement as he squeezed her fingers even harder. I could stay like this all night, Princess. Evangeline's instincts took over then. Chaos might be stronger, but that didn't mean he possessed all the power. Her lips had stopped bleeding, but after another quick nip from her teeth, there were fresh blood. Leaning forward, she pressed her mouth to the cage and said, Please open. The bars lifted immediately. A flash of surprise lit Chaos' dead eyes. Evangeline felt a rush of victory right before he flattened her to the bed with the full force of his body. The air squeezed from her lungs as she fought in vain against him. He was so heavy and hot atop her, and she swore he burned even hotter the more she struggled. Yet, she couldn't bring herself to stop the fight. She wasn't sure if it was the venom or just her human instincts reacting to the fact that she was pinned to a bed by death incarnate. She tried to claw his helm, but Chaos effortlessly grabbed her wrist and pinned her arms over her head. Why are you doing this, she wheezed. Jax asked me to keep you human. I don't need you to keep me human. I have no desire to change. But you're not in control of your body, because you're on top of it. Chaos lifted some of his weight, though his hands continued to trap her wrist and his neck still pressed firmly against hers. Dimly, she knew this was for the best. He was right. She wasn't in complete control, but she never felt more trapped in her life. She thought she had been uncomfortable inside the cage, but now it was even worse. With chaos pressed against her, it wasn't just her mouth that burned. Her entire body was on fire. Her skin was flushed, her heart was racing, and the heat pounding off chaos only made it worse. She thought of Jax and the way his cool skin would instantly smooth hers. She remembered how he touched her that night in the crypt, his mouth on her neck, his chest pressed to hers. He hadn't bitten her. He just touched her. That was all she wanted. Jax won't care if you let me go, she insisted. As long as I'm just still a key capable of opening things, he isn't concerned about anything else. You're wrong about that, princess. Jax doesn't want this life for you. Chaos met her eyes again, flames mingling with the shadows of his death-like gaze. Evangeline paused, her struggling. For a moment she wanted to believe the vampire. She liked the idea that Jax cared about what happened to her. But it was far more likely that Jax just wanted her to think that he worried and it's another way to manipulate her. Did Jax tell you that? Jax doesn't tell me what to say, but he told you to keep me human. She attempted another kick. Chaos pressed the full force of his weight against her once more. I'm doing this for Jax out of loyalty, but that is not the only reason I'm here. Then what's your other reason? She nodded. I'm disappointed you have to ask. Chaos angled his head. The bronze jaw of his helm brushed her cheek, briefly searing her skin. Sweat beaded against her brow as the words she'd noticed earlier, the ones inscribed upon the helm, began to glow. The tongue was an ancient script she'd seen before, one she recognized but couldn't decipher, the language of the Valors. What does it say? She asked. It's a curse that prevents me from removing the helm. And Chaos wanted the helm removed. No wonder he was so hot against her, so hungry. She didn't know how long the helm had prevented him from feeding, but Evangeline imagined it had to be agony for a vampire to live without blood. She had only been infected with the venom for a short period of time, and she already felt a little mad. Let me guess, you want me to unlock your helm with my blood. He made a sound too damaged to be called a laugh. Your blood, unfortunately, isn't capable of breaking this curse, but every curse has a back door. Chaos said the last set of words hotly, and if he'd intended to say something else, but the words had magically twisted. It made Evangeline think of when Nella had tried to tell her that she believed the Valeyard contained, but the story curse had prevented her. Suddenly, Evangeline knew what Chaos wanted. He wanted the same thing as Jax. That was why the two of them were working together. You want me to open the arch. You think that the valley holds the key to unlocking your cursed helm. I don't think. I know it does, Chaos said, something like pain seeping into his voice. He took a deep breath, and his chest moved against hers, turning her skin violently hot again. What the hell are you doing? Jax growled. Evangeline turned toward his voice, sweat trickling down her cheek, as she found him standing in the doorway. A vein dropped furiously along the line of his smooth marble neck. His skin looked so cool, and she was so hot. All she wanted was to press her mouth to his throat and maybe lick it just once. Her blood rushed faster at the thought, and her fangs started to lengthen. Jax, get out of here, Chaos ordered, unless you change your mind about her becoming a vampire. Chaos grabbed Evangeline's wrist tighter, pressing them along with her more firmly to the bed. She writhed against her grip. He was crushing her again with the full length of his body, something that cracked in the doorway. Her eyes shot back to Jax, who was twisting the now-splintered edge of the door. Had he done that with his hands? He certainly looked livid enough. His silver blue eyes turned midnight dark as he watched her struggle under Chaos. Evangeline dimly knew that she should stop her trashing. If she broke free from Chaos and managed to bite Jax, the life she had, the life she wanted to keep, would be over. But she also wanted this. She wanted Jax to stop her struggling. She wanted him to rip Chaos off her chest so that he could pin her down to the bed instead. Evangeline took a rasping breath, and her gaze collided with Jax once more. He scrubbed a hand over his jaw. With Evangeline's heightened senses, she could hear it clench under his palm. Then she heard the scrap of Jack's boots as he sharply turned and disappeared down the hall.